What's up, guys? I think we're gonna do this one. This is Coffee House Crimes. Serial killer's TikTok video accidentally reveals his horrifying secrets. Let's see.
Nada, amigo. Aquí Anita Montilla. Pues rompo definitivamente con esa amiga con la que estuve un tiempo conviviendo. Un abrazo para todo el mundo. Ciao. Bye bye.
It was in the summer of 2023 that 42-year-old Esther Estapa disappeared while traveling across Spain. But the thing is, she was not alone. At the time, Esther was traveling with a TikToker that she had only recently met. And when her family started to receive haunting phone calls from that TikToker, well, they knew that something was wrong. You see, Montilla knew all too well that Esther was missing. In fact, he was the only one who claimed to know where she had last been seen. And when he made more and more effort to insert himself into the search, all while documenting his every move on TikTok, Esther's family couldn't help but feel like he must know something more. Now, the police seemed calm enough. However, when Esther's family did a quick Google search, they found something that officers seemed to miss. That this traveler who promised to find Esther was actually a convicted serial killer who somehow was then allowed back out into the public. Welcome back to Coffee House Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're traveling to Spain to talk about a case that I honestly struggle to believe, if I'm honest with you. I actually wanted to talk to you about this one because I genuinely can't fathom how many mistakes and screw-ups made throughout the entire story. And with this one spanning over 40 years, several families, and two entirely different eras, you're probably going to think these are two separate stories, but they aren't. By the way, apologies for not being in the coffee house today, folks, but I'm currently traveling on business to bring new things to you in the future. And on that note, keep your eyes peeled because there are really cool things coming up. Now, before we begin, folks, I would like you to help me out with something here, but if you could drop me a comment telling me which country you're watching from and also giving this video a like, I really would appreciate it. And I'll be trying to reply to every comment in the first day of this video going live. Thank you. And so, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Jose Jurado Montilla. Hey there, folks, and welcome to Spain. Sunny welcomes aside, it was around 5:30 p.m. on August the 23rd, 2023, that Josefa Pepe Perez suddenly started to receive a slew of strange messages from her 42-year-old daughter, Esther Estapa. Now, Esther was a traveler, but despite that, she and her mother were always incredibly close to each other. No matter where Esther was in the world, she would always make contact with her mum every single day, just to check in and say that she was fine. However, there was something very strange about these messages that just felt a little bit different. In these messages, Esther claimed that she had now suddenly run out of money and was completely broke. And she also claimed that she hadn't always been honest with her mother, that she was now living on the streets with two Argentinian women. There was one other jarring comment that she made too. Apparently, she was now planning to leave Spain altogether, and she was going to move to Argentina, of all places, to begin a new life. Which, quite honestly, to her mother did not sound like Esther. She called her daughter to have a little discussion or at least find some reassurance. However, every single time she called her mobile phone, there was no answer. She tried again and again and again, but unfortunately, with each and every attempt, her call would remain without an answer. Now knowing that something was clearly up, Heather even asked Esther to send a voice message or appear on video call, even if just for a brief moment. Basically, just anything that would prove it was actually her typing those text messages and nobody else. However, as you can likely imagine, Esther never replied. Unsure of what to do, Pepper called her other daughter, of course that being Esther's sister, Raquel. Being both younger and a little more savvy with social messaging apps, maybe Raquel could shed some light on the situation. And when Pepper asked Raquel if she had heard from Esther, the answer was also no. After doing a little investigating, Raquel also realized the exact same thing, that the spelling from Esther was unusual, the language felt strange, and the words simply did not sound like Esther. In fact, by now, Raquel was certain that this was not her sister. Throughout the evening, more and more messages came through, with each one containing even stranger and unusual spelling mistakes. They would also spot several other phrases that Esther would not normally ever use. And then, just as they got extremely suspicious, and all of a sudden, those messages stopped. And Esther's phone was then switched off, never to be called again. Now, Esther was already known to live quite the nomadic lifestyle, and so it wasn't unusual for her to drop off the face of the earth. But this, it felt very different. She had already spent several years traveling from one place to another, and rarely would settle anywhere for too long. It was essentially just who she was to keep moving. So yes, at least geographically speaking, Esther had a habit of disappearing for a while. But the thing is that she would never actually vanish from her family online. Regardless of where she was or what was happening in her life at the time, she would always find the time to message her mother. And so, now that all of a sudden she had not only vanished, but vanished just after sending a slew of very strange messages, well, it's no surprise that Pepper panicked and then contacted the police to report her as missing. However, there was one problem here. You see, Esther was a 42-year-old adult woman, and if she wanted to disappear, she had the right to do so. With that said, officers initially suggested that maybe she just simply disappeared voluntarily. Basically, in other words, they told her mother to just chill out. Now, of course, both Pepper and Raquel kind of understood their reasoning, but that didn't explain the spelling mistakes, strange language, or why Esther refused to speak to them. And being honest, it also didn't explain why someone who previously would contact her mother every single day had now suddenly switched off the phone, never to return again. So, with that said, officers slowly and begrudgingly started the task of looking into who precisely Esther was. 42 years old at the time that she disappeared, those who knew Esther described her as affectionate, cheerful, and always in motion. She had always been close to Mother, and according to her family, it was rare to see her without a smile on her face. And it turns out that Esther came from a large, tight-knit family too. In 2013, she decided to leave Seville and begin exploring on her own. At the time, her family were worried about her and her decision to travel, and they also seemed to struggle to understand why she was so determined to leave her old life behind. But the truth is, that is just who Esther was. She was filled with wanderlust, and she wanted to see what else was beyond home. She wanted to meet new people, find new hobbies, and experience life in a more broad sense. And so, over the years that followed, Esther moved from one place to another.
Crying.
And rarely stayed still. I think the longest time she would ever stay in one place
that
was
doesn't normally happen to me, but goodness gracious, that one was intense.
For Esther, she was free. However, for her Pepper, it was more like a constant source of anxiety. She kind of worried that maybe her daughter was depressed, or maybe she was even running away from something. Because, let's be honest, some people do only travel to be away from their problems. And so, no matter how far Esther traveled, Pepper would always keep a close eye on her daughter, making sure that the two of them would speak or at least message every single day. Unfortunately, over those years, Esther's time away from the family would also be patchy at times, because according to her family, all of her more recent relationships had become severely abusive. I'm not talking about name-calling or small stuff here, but actual imprisonment. Apparently, a previous boyfriend would keep her locked inside their home with the blinds closed, and whenever he left the house, he would leave without leaving her a key or an easy way to escape. So essentially, Esther had found herself to become a prisoner to some pig in an unfamiliar country. Her family also claimed that he would regularly assault her, burn her with cigarettes, and had even thrown her across the room. And when her family tried to intervene, not only would the abuse escalate, but he would also reportedly threaten multiple members of her family. It was in the year 2022 that her partner was finally arrested on charges of domestic violence. Esther was then taken to a women's shelter in Alicante, where, at least in theory, she would finally be somewhere safe. But it turns out that life inside that shelter was difficult for her too, because with strict sleep schedules, rules, and very little freedom, it basically felt as though she had escaped from one prison just to find herself in another. And so, yes, it's no surprise to learn that Esther left as soon as she could. It was shortly after that Esther travelled to the town of Mutsamel, where she then attended a medieval fair and met a man named Marcello. The two immediately connected, and apparently what followed was a whirlwind romance. Over the course of the next few months, they travelled around together, but unfortunately, they eventually began to grow apart. And it was during one of those final meetings together that Esther told Marcello that she had actually recently met somebody else. Not a romantic partner, by the way, but a traveller, someone that she could now go alongside with. From what Esther had told Marcello, apparently this man was someone who documented his journeys on TikTok and would walk long distances across the country. But otherwise, she kept the details about him quite vague. Now, at least from what we know, this man invited Esther to join him on an adventure across the Spanish peninsula. He told her that they would travel together until they found somewhere they wanted to stay. And the surprising thing here is that Esther accepted his offer. But the thing is, what she didn't know is that the man she'd chosen to travel with was actually hiding something very, very dark. In fact, it's probably far worse than almost all of us could imagine. Because when you think of the ultimate nightmare human, you'd probably go for a murderer, right? You don't usually stop to think, well, maybe it's not one person, but several. Maybe they're a serial killer. Oh. Unfortunately, that is precisely who Esther stumbled upon.
Dear.
Let's be honest here. It's not something that she could have ever possibly imagined or even considered when she agreed to join him. Because apparently, this man, he was a real charmer. And so, on that note, who precisely was this mysterious TikToker?
En el cual rompo híbricamente con esa amiga con la que estuve un tiempo conviviendo.
The man's name was Jose Gerardo Montilla. Born in 1861 in the rural district of Campanales in the outskirts of Malaga, Montilla spent much of his childhood in the rugged Spanish countryside. And it turns out that eventually he would use that to his advantage on social media. Using the name Dynamiter Montilla, of course that meaning Dynamite Montilla, he had accrued several thousand followers on TikTok, where he would record himself on his long-distance walks across Spain. He would mostly present himself as this free-spirited traveller, kind of like a wandering lover of nature who would happily explore isolated trails, meet strangers along the way, and then sleep under the stars. And so, to his followers, Dynamiter Montilla was simply an adventurer. However, as you already know by now, behind that facade was a horrible person, because not only was he plagued with extreme violence and had spent decades behind bars, but he had a history so terrible that you will wonder how on earth he was ever allowed back out into the public.
Okay.
Now, we will turn to that in a short while, but...
Picking up the theme. Since I'm not done yet. That theme. We've seen it lately, where people with bigger social media followings have been caught for doing the things they shouldn't be doing, and in some cases doubling down and continuing.
For now, what I want you to remember here is that while in the middle of TikTok growth, Montilla had been traveling alongside Esther at the time that she disappeared. And according to her mother, Pepper, it was on September the 8th, that being 2 weeks after Esther disappeared, that she then suddenly received a telephone call from Montilla himself. Now, in this phone call, Montilla explained that he had met Esther at the women's shelter in Alicante. It was in that moment that the two apparently became friends and then eventually started traveling around Spain together, beginning in Alicante, before then walking across the region until they reached the coastal city of Gandia. Montilla claims the police had contacted him 3 days prior, on September the 5th, to ask if he knew where Esther was and if she was still with him. That is what he told officers that, unfortunately, she wasn't, and according to him, the two had separated in Gandia, where he then continued to travel alone. However, as his conversation with Pepper continued, she noticed that Montilla had become unusually emotional about what he described as their brief 21-day friendship. And what she found quite creepy is how he told her that, apparently, he had never met anyone quite like her before. He spoke about about the long, meaningful conversations that they shared while walking together, and admitted that, despite knowing her for less than a month, he actually still thought about her quite often. In other words, those 21 days had been truly unforgettable to him. Of course, it's not out the realm of the ordinary to wonder if maybe he had just called Pepper because he was simply concerned about Esther. I mean, she was missing after all, right? But the thing is, when he called Pepper again a few days later, there was something different about her behavior. In fact, she was quick to realize that something just seemed off. The really strange thing here is that Montia seemed to be determined to place himself at the very center of her investigation, and it wasn't in a subtle way either, because he seemed to ask a lot of paranoid questions. Things like how the police search was progressing, had they discovered anything, were they any closer to find her, and could someone else maybe be involved? Pepper was honest with Montia, and she told him that they're still looking into the case because, quite frankly, police officers had no idea about what had happened yet. However, she did also explain to him that the case now seemed to be being transferred to the Homicide Division in Alicante. And here's the other weird thing, because Montia had recently claimed that apparently he was currently in Malaga with very little money. But now that he knew that this was now a homicide investigation, well, he changed his tone completely and said that he now intended to head over to her last known location to do a little search of his own. What a good little Samaritan, eh? So anyway, Montia now promised that he would return to Alicante, retrace the route that he and Esther had traveled together, question anyone that they had spoken to along the way, and then search for any sign of where she might have gone. It would have been an extraordinary amount of effort, but of course, good old faithful Montia was up to the challenge. Pepper had concerns though, and she told Montia that she believed that something terrible must have happened to her daughter. However, funnily enough, Montia immediately dismissed that possibility. Instead, he told her to have faith, stay strong, and wait for him to do his own thing. And so, with that said, he ended the call.
Is this pre-recorded? No.
Slowly but surely, the police who were doing their own formal investigation started to retrace Esther's movements and actions. And as it
Currently 2:06 a.m. on this coast.
turns out, most of the early information would actually come from Montia himself. You see, to begin
87.
with, Montia had actually sent her Esther's contact list. According to him, she had recently placed her SIM card inside his phone, which caused several of her numbers to save onto his mobile. Shortly after, Pepper passed the screenshot directly to investigators, and among the names on that list were two of Esther's friends named Miguel and Vanessa. There was no actual way that officers could have contacted Miguel or Vanessa without Montia's information, but of course, with thanks to his screenshots, they could. And so, when police contacted Vanessa and Miguel, they explained that Esther had in fact stayed at their home for around 20 days before leaving Alicante during the summer of 2023. And after the police contacted Vanessa, well, that actually prompted her to begin her own small investigation too. It was shortly after Pepper mentioning that Montia had his own active TikTok account that Vanessa started to work her own way through his videos one by one, hoping that somehow she might find something that could help explain her disappearance. Now, at least initially, the account did actually seem useful. Montia documented almost everything about him, including where he traveled, who he met, the place he slept, and more recently, his own efforts to find Esther. She'd even admit that at first, she kind of found his videos interesting. However, over time, and the longer that she watched, the more uncomfortable that she became. You see, there was something about Montia that didn't quite sit right with her. It was something about his expression, she thought. Something in his eyes that made him feel, well, not so harmless after all. And that is when she found one specific video. It was in this video that Montia casually talked about an argument that he had with someone a few years prior, claiming that he had, quote, smashed someone's face in and knocked out their teeth. It was in that moment that she realized that, all of a sudden, this family-friendly illusion was actually fake. That this wasn't an older man simply wandering across Spain while filming his adventures, but instead was an angry, violent, real piece of work. And the more that Vanessa watched these videos, the more that she began to wonder whether the person Montia presented to the world was actually...
What you're seeing in the reflection of the window, more than likely.
wonder
right
where we've
across.
seen that before,
See?
folks. And when she found those videos of him claiming that apparently he had spent many romantic nights in that bush with Esther, that she truly became disgusted.
Estoy pensando que estamos a la víspera de San Valentín. Y precisamente hace un rato he colgado un vídeo.
Now, up until this point in time, Vanessa and the rest of Esther's family did, of course, have doubts. At the very least, they thought Montia was a little bit strange, you could say, and they may have even wondered if maybe there was something more sinister to him too. But at the end of the day, they had very little proof. That is, of course, minus the massive serial killer red flag. But when they realized that there were TikTok videos suggesting that he was still potentially violent, I am sure that struck a new nerve. And, of course, so would have the videos where he claimed that apparently he was both romantic and sexually involved with Esther. However, if he thought that was bad, well, just wait until what happened next. Now a little more concerned about who Montia really was, they decided to get on the old Google and do a little more investigating of their own. And when Esther's mother and aunt decided to search his name online, what they found really would send their anxiety into overdrive. It was right there, and in a news article published in the year 2013, that they realized that Jose Gerardo Montilla was not a friend or cringe TikTok traveler, but instead was actually a convicted serial killer who served several decades in prison for the murders of 4 people. Now, quite understandably, they immediately took this article and its information directly to the police. However, the response they received was almost as wild as their discovery, because when they confronted the officers about it, they merely insisted that they must have found the wrong Jose Montilla. The information available to investigators apparently showed only one previous conviction: theft. Of course, that being far from murder. And that was strange, because Esther's family found out this information through Google alone, something which, quite frankly, isn't even comparable to the sophisticated internal databases that the police department should have access to. Even after showing these officers the news article, they all still remained unconvinced. And according to Esther's family, they were even told, quote, "This man wouldn't hurt a fly." Honestly, I can only imagine how completely surreal and frustrating this must have felt. It is almost indisputable that Esther had disappeared while traveling with this man, and now her family found out that he actually was a convicted serial killer. Yet, despite this, the very people who are responsible for investigating her disappearance seemed to actually have no real idea of who he actually was. And even worse, even when they were told about history, they still wouldn't believe it. All they really needed to do here was connect a public TikTok account to the same name as a convicted serial killer. However, apparently, that is asking too much from them. And it's not like Montilla had kept this a secret either, because in several of his videos, he even openly spoke about having spent decades behind bars. The only difference here is that he never called himself a guilty man, but instead claimed that he'd been convicted of crimes that he never actually committed, and would even go on to claim that apparently he was the victim of monumental injustice. Because according to this guy, it wasn't just the police or the courts that had an issue with him, but the entire world. And although Montilla was happy to talk about his years behind bars, he was far less willing to explain exactly what put him there in the first place. Yeah, I wonder why. So, talking about those serial killings, because of course, that is not a small part to this story. It was in November in 1985 in Malaga that Montilla claimed that he had been hunting foxes. Apparently, they were attacking his mother's chickens, so all things considered, he wanted them gone. It was while he was out there hunting that apparently he was caught in a violent downpour. Seeking shelter from the storm, he entered a nearby farmhouse and remained there overnight. Because apparently, when it rains, you plan an impromptu sleepover in an unfamiliar barnyard. According to Montilla, the owner of the property, that being 57-year-old Francisco Gonzalez, then opened the door and immediately pointed a shotgun at his face. But thankfully, the wit and sharp young Montilla was both smart and fast. He claimed that apparently and somehow managed to grab the shotgun from Francisco and then fire in self-defense, unfortunately killing him in the process. However, there was one problem with Montilla's story. There were witnesses, and those witnesses claimed that apparently Francisco was unarmed. From that moment onwards, Montilla claimed that he'd become the victim of a conspiracy, and that somehow the world had decided to turn against him. 2 years later, in March of 1987, another man was killed in Cortillo Los Ríos in Campanillas. Antonio Perel was 46 years old and previously worked as a chauffeur. It was on a random morning that month that his partially burned body was found inside a rural property. Once again, Montilla denied to have any involvement in his death, and later claimed that after his first encounter with the police, investigators simply started to blame him for every violent crime committed in that part of the country. And then 2 more murders would take place later that year near El Chorro, that being a popular beauty spot filled with many tourists in Malaga. 2 young tourists, that being one British and one German, had both travelled there together and camping in the area. They were to be found dead, with both their bodies bearing gunshot wounds and injuries caused by a knife. The locations of these 4 murders would tell investigators something very, very important. Each of them fell within roughly the same geographical area. They all seemed to share very familiar characteristics, because not only were they all in isolated and rural places, but with this TikTok videos, all of them were places that Montilla knew extremely well. Not only that, it also appeared that all of the victims were approached with very little chance of anyone else witnessing what happened. Of course, excluding the first one, where actually there were witnesses. It was on May the 4th, 1987, that being around 2 years after Francisco's murder, that Montilla was finally arrested near a train station in Alora. Several months later, Montilla was then convicted of all 4 of those murders, before then being sentenced to 123 years in prison. So, case closed, throw away the key, right? Oh, the horrifying thing here is that Montilla would only serve 28 of those 123 years. And the reason for it is extremely infuriating. Under Spain's former sentencing system, prisoners who were serving multiple sentences were still subjected to a maximum period of actual imprisonment, meaning those 123 years was actually a maximum of 30. In addition to this, the so-called Parrot Doctrine later changed how reductions for good behavior and prison work were calculated, applying them across each individual sentence rather than against the maximum term itself. It basically meant that some of Spain's most serious offenders would remain behind bars for considerably longer. However, in 2013, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the doctrine could not be applied retroactively to prisoners' offences, and original sentences predated that change. The court basically found that doing so had violated protections under Article 7 concerning punishment without law, as well as Article 5 concerning liberty and security. So, reducing all that mumbo-jumbo for you, the thought of it is that Spanish courts were therefore required to recalculate release dates of affected prisoners. And in Montilla's case, the ruling reportedly brought his release forward by around 2 years total. So, in December 2013, and after serving 28 years for the murder of 4 people, Jose Montilla actually walked free. Again, that is 28 years after murdering 4 people in total, meaning that he essentially served 7 years for each person he killed. By May of 2024, and despite now knowing that Montilla may have actually murdered her daughter, Esther's mother was still cleverly and discreetly in contact with him. She made the decision to never directly accuse Montilla, but instead listened carefully to every word, comment, and conversation that came from him. She was doing this, of course, hoping that maybe eventually he would accidentally expose a lie. And Montilla continued to ask her about the investigation too, and every time he did, Pepper would give him the same exact answer, that apparently the police still knew absolutely nothing at all. It turns out that Esther's family would also speak to him on several occasions. However, as you can imagine, each and every conversation would leave him angry, depleted, and deeply unsettled. You can't blame them either, because not only were they being asked to remain friendly with a convicted serial killer, but also with someone who very likely murdered their own daughter. It was around this time that Montilla started giving his own theories about what happened to Esther. Things like maybe she'd joined a commune, or maybe she'd become a victim of human trafficking, because apparently honesty wasn't an option for him. Meanwhile, Vanessa resumed her own investigation by working through Montilla's TikTok account. She had to through basically everything, including his uncomfortable encounters with strangers, his rambling updates, and the endless videos where he appeared to be speaking to people who were never actually shown or seen on camera. And then she noticed that in one of those videos, Montilla claimed that he had shown somebody a photograph of Esther, to which they replied with, "Yes, I've seen her." It's funny because Montilla basically recorded everything. In fact, he recorded so many stories in front of his camera that eventually they all kind of started to contradict each other. His relentless need for TikTok attention was slowly creating a public record of his own consistencies, and the great part of it is that Esther's family were able to watch this happen in real time. In one of his videos, Montilla first claimed that he had accompanied Esther to a hospital in India, where she then received an injection for an injured foot and then slowly began to feel better. In the second video, he then claimed that the two had separated on a bench before Esther then went to the hospital alone, and furthermore, that this was apparently the last time he saw her. Next, he then told her a different version, claiming that apparently friends then came to collect Esther after her hospital visit, which immediately struck her as strange, because Esther had never travelled to Gandia before, and as far as her family were aware, she didn't have any friends living there either. The more that Montilla spoke, the less his story held together. And again, it seems though the details in his story would really seem to change. Nevertheless, 6 agonizing months would pass, Esther's birthday would come and go, and there was absolutely no sign of her anywhere. And by now, well, it kind of felt like Esther's family doing more work than the officers, because the police, well, at this stage, they seemed to be totally unbothered. The family kept quiet publicly during this time, of course, because not doing so could potentially harm the investigation. But I guess the one surprise that nobody saw coming here is that it turns out that police were actually investigating Montilla for an entirely different reason. You see, it was a year before Esther's disappearance on August the 30th, 2022, that a father discovered the body of his 21-year-old son on their remote property in Malaga. Unfortunately, it appeared that David had been shot twice with a shotgun, with the first blast striking him from behind, the second one directly to his head. However, the one thing that the killer didn't know at the time is that shortly before David's death, actually unknowingly gave the description of his killer to his father. It was for that reason that investigators knew that the suspect was likely an older man with a shotgun who probably knew the isolated terrain relatively well. We knew this because the property itself was very difficult to reach, meaning that the killer, whoever they were, was unlikely to have stumbled across it by chance. However, the one key detail here is that shortly before he was murdered, David had told his father that the stranger claimed to be there because he was hunting foxes who killed his chickens, which, as we know, interestingly enough, was the exact same kind of explanation that Montilla had given when he killed Francisco in 1985. With this now in mind, investigators recovered dozens of samples from the crime scene. The killer appeared to have opened David's backpack before then removing both his phone and his wallet, leaving his DNA all over the zipper process. That DNA was sent for analysis, and when it was returned, they finally called a break. Although there was no direct DNA match, a family DNA search would link the sample to a relative of the killer, and after reconstructing an extended family tree, they realized that Jose Gerardo Montilla was directly related. Of course, this was huge news for investigators, because it meant that not only may they now have its killer, but it also confirmed that Jose may still be capable of murder, which, all considered, was monumental for Esther's family. So, the police now had a serial killer, a TikTok channel, and conclusive DNA analysis. All they had to do now was find the one person who was attached to all three of those things. And with to as many TikTok videos, it was actually relatively easy to find Montia. I mean, much like a narcissist with a megaphone, he essentially announced everywhere he went. Around 9 months after Esther's disappearance, Montia shared that he was now heading towards Badajoz. Detectives would follow him discreetly and collect his cigarette butts that he discarded along the way. But with Montia moving closer and closer to Spain's neighboring country, Portugal, it was obvious that they were rather pressed for time. With this in mind, detectives asked for the DNA analysis to be fast-tracked. All in the meanwhile, Montia continued to post online as if he had nothing to hide at all, even openly announcing that he was inside a local bar named Benito, which was great because little did he know that detectives were now outside of that bar waiting for him. And while taking this very video, they received a call from the lab to confirm that the DNA analysis was in fact a conclusive match. With that said, detectives decided not to hang about anymore. Instead, they immediately entered the bar and arrested Montia there. And just like that, the serial killer who wouldn't hurt a fly was now in custody for another murder. On February 2nd, 2024, a local tour guide named Andre Pellot was walking towards Byron Castle in Gandia. Rather than following a conventional path, he decided to pass through the old drainage tunnels beneath the road, which eventually lead into the city. It's essentially a disused canal that was once used as a shortcut. However, beyond the bridge, and once he was beside the dry coal bed, he spotted something to the side, and after taking a closer look, he realized it was unmistakable. He had just stumbled upon a human skull. Following his discovery, he of course contacted the authorities immediately, and believe it or not, although officers arrived to retrieve the skull, there was no actual effort made to secure the crime scene or even search it thoroughly. And it wasn't until June, that being 4 months after the discovery, that Esther's family received the devastating news that that skull did sadly in fact belong to her, meaning that, as painful as it was, they at least now had closure. And it was only then police returned to the area to conduct a more thorough examination, and what they found was something, or should I say a lot of something, because throughout the area they would find more than 6 human bones and several of Esther's possessions. Of course, investigators would have to prove that Montia was in fact connected to Esther's death. Because sure, on the surface it did kind of seem obvious. But that wouldn't be enough court. They needed to reconstruct Esther's final hours, and more crucially, prove that Montia had actually been there with her at the time. So, they turned their attention back towards the health center in Gandia, the place where Montia claimed that he had apparently last seen Esther. But the curious detail here is that his story seemed to change every time he told it. Sometimes he said gone inside with her, and other times he claimed that friends had her up instead. However, the stroke of luck here is that somehow one of the doctors actually remembered seeing Esther that night, and the other detail that he remembered was that she was in fact another man who closely matched Montia's appearance. Now, according to the doctor and other witnesses, it turns out that Esther was in an argument with a member of staff. It kind of makes sense, because not only was her foot injured, but she was also exhausted and desperately wanted to stay there overnight. However, after the staff explained to her that it was not possible, she kicked off. And it was only then that Montia intervened and then tried to persuade Esther to leave with him. It could have appeared that everybody wanted her out of that building, except, of course, for Esther herself. And so, at 12:30 that morning, the two left the hospital together before then heading toward that canal near Bahrain Castle. Investigators also realized that she had arranged to meet a BlaBla car driver the next day, where she then planned to drive to Valencia. The thing is, she never actually arrived for that drive, and of course, later that afternoon, Pepper then started to receive strange text messages that were apparently written by her daughter. Another thing that investigators realized is that although messages had in fact been sent from Esther's phone, the device actually accessed the internet using Montia's mobile hotspot. And even more strange, wasn't the only time. On December the 8th, that being 3 months after she was murdered, Esther's phone would switch on yet again. While switched on, it was also connected to Montia's phone. So it means that at this point, his involvement was almost impossible to ignore. And another thing, but throughout those same months, Montia had told Pepper that he tried to call and text Esther on numerous occasions. However, now that they actually had his records, they realized that it was actually all one giant lie. In the months that followed, the overdue investigation finally uncovered a bunch of other details that connected Montia to her death, and one of those was deeply unsettling. When Esther's soul was examined, investigators discovered an impression that resembled a small crucifix pressed into the bone, almost as if the object had remained against it for a long period of time. Montia was arrested. Officers, of course, searched his possessions. And what do you think they found? A small silver crucifix which matched the imprint. This suggested that after Esther's death, Montia then returned to her gravesite to find the crucifix and then wear it as a trophy. And the most damning evidence to this case would be what they actually found on his mobile phone. Because hidden inside an album, they found several photos of Esther's body, partially unclothed, at the very location the body was found. And so, after more than a year of changing stories, staged searches, and woeful TikTok videos, Montia's own phone finally revealed what he had been trying so desperately to hide. On June the 10th of 2026, Montia was sentenced to 24 years and 6 months in prison for the murder of David. That conviction, of course, would make David the 5th person Montia had been found guilty of killing. However, as we know, there is still one case here that still remains unresolved. At the time of this recording, Montia is still yet to face trial for Esther's murder. This, of course, means that not only has he not yet been convicted in her case, but he also continues to deny any involvement in her death.
You've seen that too, denial and continuance.
Wrapping the video up, all I can really say about one is what a genuinely unbelievable story. Because when you think about it, it actually...
He sneezes. What I will say is liars always lose. Eventually, the tables turn. The divine prism. Dreams, my darlings. 1, 2, 3. Dreams. Grand rise. And I'll catch you on the next one. Happy in between.